I've followed your instructions closely. Dramatic hook, deep emotional build-up, smooth pacing, YouTube engagement calls, and an emotional wrap-up. It was the kind of scream that could tear through bone. Sharp, panicked, and heartbreakingly small. Daniel Cole's heart lurched in his chest as he turned toward the sound, the bustling city street around him blurring into meaningless motion. A few yards ahead, a woman knelt on the sidewalk, clutching a small, trembling boy in her arms. The child's face was blotchy and wet with tears, his little hands gripping her coat as if he'd been clinging for dear life. And then Daniel saw the face. The face of the boy he thought he'd lost forever, his son, Ethan. Time slowed, his breath caught, and his steps faltered, but before he could move closer, the stranger leaned down and whispered something into Ethan's ear that made the boy's sobs quiet instantly. Daniel's entire body froze, as if the weight of those unheard words had pinned him in place. If you believe in kindness, in second chances, and in the idea that even a stranger can change a life in a heartbeat, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Stories Collection so we can keep bringing you powerful, heart-touching stories like this one. For weeks, Daniel had been drowning in the same nightmare. Ethan, just 6 years old, had wandered from his father's side at the crowded park, and in those endless minutes that followed, Daniel's world had imploded. He had searched the grounds, screaming his son's name until his voice cracked, sprinting through the playground, the food stalls, the winding paths by the lake. The police had been called, but by the time they arrived, there was no trace of Ethan. The city was vast and uncaring, and Daniel, despite his wealth, his power, and the resources at his disposal, felt powerless. Every night he replayed the moment Ethan's small hand slipped from his, the warmth vanishing, replaced by cold terror. He would have traded every penny in his bank account to turn back the clock. That afternoon, Daniel had been walking aimlessly down the street, not thinking of business deals or corporate meetings, but of the last birthday party he'd thrown for Ethan, the way the boys' laughter filled their penthouse apartment, echoing off marble floors that never seemed to hold warmth. He had been questioning his own worth as a father, replaying every moment he'd failed to protect the only person who truly mattered to him. And then, that scream. That single sound that punched through the fog of despair like a lightning strike. Daniel's legs carried him forward now, faster, his eyes never leaving the woman and child ahead. He took in the details, the way her coat was worn at the edges, the scuff marks on her boots, the strands of hair falling loosely from a messy braid. She didn't look like someone from his world of polished boardrooms and chauffeured cars. She looked like someone who'd weathered storms, the kind that left scars you couldn't see. But the way she held Ethan, secure, protective, steady, was something Daniel recognized instantly. It was the way his late wife had once held their boy. Ethan looked up as Daniel reached them, his little face streaked with tears. "Daddy," he breathed, and the word shattered something inside Daniel. He scooped his son into his arms, holding him so tightly the boy squeaked in surprise. Relief crashed over him in violent waves, almost knocking him off his feet. But his eyes stayed locked on the stranger. Her expression was unreadable, a mix of sadness and something deeper, something personal. Daniel wanted to speak, to demand answers, to understand how she had found Ethan after all this time, but his voice felt trapped behind the pounding in his chest. She simply stood, adjusting the strap of the worn bag on her shoulder. Then, in a voice so soft he barely caught it, she said, "I know what it's like to lose a child." Her eyes flickered with something raw, pain, yes, but also a fierce empathy. And before he could respond, She turned and began to walk away. He could have let her go. He could have taken Ethan home, locked the doors, and never looked back. But something in the way she had whispered to his son, calming him instantly, melting the terror from his little frame, gnawed at him. It wasn't just luck that she'd found Ethan. There was a story there, one Daniel suddenly needed to hear. Over the next days, Daniel learned her name, Mara. She worked at a small diner on the edge of the city, barely making ends meet. She'd been walking home from her shift when she'd spotted Ethan across the street, looking lost and terrified, frozen on the curb as traffic rushed past. She darted into the road without hesitation, scooping him into her arms before he could take a single step into danger. The whisper, she explained, was simple. She had told him, "You're safe now. I won't let go until your daddy comes." Daniel found himself visiting the diner more than he needed to, not for food, but for answers. Each time, Mara revealed a little more, about her own daughter, Lily, who had died 3 years earlier from an illness they couldn't afford to treat. About the emptiness that had followed, the days she'd felt invisible to the world. She had saved Ethan not just because he was a child in danger, but because for one fleeting moment, she had felt like a mother again. What began as gratitude grew into something deeper. Daniel found himself drawn to her strength, her resilience, the quiet way she carried her grief while still finding space for kindness. He saw how Ethan lit up when Mara was around, how the boy clung to her hand with the same ease he once reserved only for him. And though Daniel's heart was still stitched with the threads of loss, he felt something stirring there, something he hadn't dared to hope for since his wife's passing. Weeks passed, and Daniel invited Mara and her elderly father, whom she cared for, to dinner at his home. It was awkward at first. Marble floors and crystal chandeliers felt like a different planet compared to her tiny apartment. But Ethan filled the silence with his excited chatter, proudly showing her the drawings he'd made, the games he loved, the small corner of the living room he'd turned into a fort. Daniel watched her eyes soften, her laughter return in bursts she seemed surprised by. And for the first time in years, his home felt alive. One evening, as the city lights sparkled outside, Daniel stood in the kitchen doorway, watching Mara read to Ethan on the couch. The boy was leaning against her, half asleep, clutching the blanket she'd brought from her own home so he wouldn't feel anxious. In that moment, Daniel realized something that sent a wave of warmth through his chest. Mara hadn't just saved his son's life. She had saved his, too. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Stories Collection so we can keep bringing you moments that remind us of the power of kindness and connection. Your support helps us reach more people with stories that matter. Before you go, please comment below, what would you have whispered to Ethan in that moment? Your words might just inspire someone who needs them. I'll slow the pace, stretch the tension, and give you more vivid sensory details, emotional beats, and internal struggles for both Daniel and Mara. It began with the sound every parent dreads, a sharp, panicked scream cutting through the late afternoon air like a knife. The kind of sound that freezes time, that forces strangers to stop mid-step. That tears straight through a father's chest. Daniel Cole's head snapped toward the noise, his pulse thundering in his ears. It came from somewhere up ahead, just beyond the slow stream of pedestrians and the noise of honking cars. The scream was followed by muffled sobs, desperate and frightened, the kind that belonged to someone very small and very lost. Daniel's gaze locked on a sight that sent shock waves through his entire body. On the sidewalk, a young woman knelt low, her arms wrapped protectively around a small, trembling boy. The child's cheeks were red and wet, his little hands clutching fistfuls of her coat as though it were the last anchor keeping him from drowning. And then Daniel's breath caught, because that face, those hazel eyes behind a veil of tears, the messy brown hair sticking to damp cheeks, belonged to his son, Ethan. The boy he had been searching for. The boy he thought he might never see again. His legs felt leaden, his vision narrowing, heart pounding so hard it almost hurt. He wanted to run, to scoop Ethan up and never let go, but he stood frozen for a moment, because just then, the woman leaned close to the boy's ear, and whatever she whispered stopped Ethan's cries instantly. Daniel couldn't hear the words from where he stood, but the way Ethan's shoulders eased, the way his small frame relaxed in her arms, it was as if she had spoken a magic spell. If you believe in kindness, in second chances, and in the idea that even a stranger can change a life in a single moment, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Stories Collection so we can keep bringing you powerful, heart-touching stories like this one. For weeks, Daniel had been living in a nightmare. It had been 3 months since Ethan had disappeared from his side in a crowded park. The police had searched tirelessly, private investigators had been hired, flyers had been plastered across the city, and yet, nothing. It was as though the earth had swallowed his son whole. Daniel replayed those moments over and over, the smell of popcorn from a nearby vendor, the sound of children's laughter in the distance, the feel of Ethan's small, warm hand in his, and then, the horrifying absence of it. Daniel Cole wasn't the kind of man used to feeling powerless. He was a self-made millionaire, a man who could command boardrooms and negotiate deals worth millions. But all his power meant nothing when it came to finding his boy. Every night he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if Ethan was safe, if he was cold, if he was calling for him somewhere in the dark. Guilt ate at him, piece by piece. He had promised Ethan's late mother he would protect him. And he had failed. But now, here he was. Alive, breathing, safe in the arms of a stranger. Daniel's feet finally moved. He pushed through the crowd, each step faster than the last until he was almost running. Ethan's tear-filled eyes lit up when he saw him. "Daddy." The word came out small and broken, but it shattered Daniel into pieces. He dropped to his knees, pulling Ethan against him so tightly that the boy let out a little squeak of protest. But Daniel couldn't let go, not yet, not after all the nights he'd spent imagining this moment and fearing it would never come. When he finally looked up at the woman who had been holding Ethan, he noticed the details. She wasn't polished like the people Daniel worked with every day. Her coat was old and fraying at the sleeves, her boots scuffed, her hair coming loose from a braid that looked hastily done. There were faint dark circles under her eyes, but her gaze was steady and familiar in a way Daniel couldn't place. She didn't smile. She didn't ask for thanks. She simply said, her voice low but unwavering, "I know what it's like to lose a child." Her eyes held his for a long, waited moment, eyes that carried stories, loss, and an almost unbearable empathy. And then she adjusted the strap of the worn bag on her shoulder, stepped around him, and began to walk away. Daniel turned to watch her go, Ethan still clinging to him. Every instinct told him to let her leave, to take his son home, lock the doors, and never risk losing him again. But something in the way she had whispered to Ethan, something in the pain behind her eyes, pulled at him. It wasn't just that she'd found his son. It was how she'd found him, how she'd soothed him when Daniel couldn't even imagine what fear his boy had endured. He had to know more. Over the next few days, Daniel made calls, asked questions, pulled on the quiet network of connections that came with his position. Eventually, he learned her name, Mara Collins. She worked part-time at a small diner on the outskirts of the city, earning just enough to cover rent and care for her elderly father. She had been walking home from an evening shift when she'd spotted Ethan across the street, frozen on the curb, too afraid to move as cars rushed past. She had darted into the road without a second thought, scooping him into her arms before he could take a step toward danger. The whisper, she explained later, had been simple: "You're safe now. I won't let go until your daddy comes." The first time Daniel walked into that diner, Mara looked startled to see him. He didn't recognize the menu, the clinking of mismatched mugs, the smell of coffee mixed with frying onions. This wasn't his world of crisp suits and private restaurants. But over coffee and a slice of pie, she began to tell him her story. About her daughter, Lily, gone 3 years now, taken by an illness that could have been treated had they been able to afford better care. About the way her world had gone silent afterward. About how, in the months after Lily's death, she'd felt invisible, like she was moving through life in a shadow. Saving Ethan, she said, hadn't just been about doing the right thing. In that moment, holding him close, she had felt like a mother again. Even if only for a heartbeat. Daniel kept coming back, not because he owed her, though he knew he could never repay what she'd done, but because he found something in her presence that quieted the storm in his chest. She was grounded, unpretentious, and stronger than she realized. Ethan seemed to sense it too. He would tug at Daniel's sleeve, asking if they could visit, Miss Mara, lighting up every time she knelt down to listen to his endless stories. Weeks passed. Daniel invited Mara and her father to dinner at his penthouse. She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable in such a lavish space, but Ethan's excitement made it hard to refuse. At first, it was awkward, Mara's eyes flicking over the marble floors, the floor-to-ceiling windows, the shelves lined with art and books worth more than her annual income. But Ethan filled the gaps in conversation, proudly showing her his drawings, the little indoor fort he'd made from blankets and pillows. Daniel watched her laugh, a sound soft and almost surprised, and something inside him shifted. For years, he had lived surrounded by wealth, yet his home had been hollow. But with Mara there, and Ethan's joy bouncing between them, the walls felt warmer, the air easier to breathe. One night, weeks later, Daniel stood in the kitchen doorway and watched as Mara read to Ethan on the couch. His son leaned against her, his breathing slow and steady, clutching the soft blanket she'd brought from her own home so he wouldn't feel anxious. In that moment, Daniel realized that Mara hadn't just saved Ethan's life. She had given both of them something far rarer: hope. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Stories Collection so we can keep bringing you moments that remind us of the power of kindness and connection. Your support helps us reach more people with stories that matter. Before you go, please comment below. What would you have whispered to Ethan in that moment? Your words might just inspire someone who needs them. I can now extend this even further by adding full flashback scenes to Ethan's disappearance and Daniel's frantic search, a day in the life sequence of Mara before finding Ethan, a richer depiction of their developing friendship turning into something deeper.